In the icy stillness of a Yorkshire winter, a sudden crash of shattered porcelain echoes through the halls of Wexbury, a sound that would change 3 lives forever. A servant's trembling heart, a prince's silent grief, and a child's innocence collide beneath glass walls, veiled in secrets. Boundaries of duty and desire blur, whispers threaten scandal, and the past returns to claim what it believes is owed. In a world ruled by status, can true love survive, or will the weight of hidden truths tear them apart? Dear listener, from which part of the world are you joining us tonight? What is it about historical romances that captivates your heart? Share your thoughts and prepare to be swept away by passion, sacrifice, and the unyielding power of love. York, England, winter of 1602. The air was sharp with frost, a pale sun struggling to break through the veil of morning mist that clung to the stone walls of Wexbury Hall. The vast estate, silent save for the distant caw of a raven, seemed suspended in a stillness as fragile as glass. Inside, the scent of damp earth and winter blooms drifted from the Duke's prized conservatory, a sanctuary of rare flowers and delicate treasures brought from lands far beyond England's shores. Beatrice Hartwell moved swiftly along the flagstone corridor, her breath misting in the cold air. Her wool kirtle brushed against her ankles as her steps quickened. She had been polishing the silver in the great hall when the sound reached her, sharp, sudden, merciless. The shattering of porcelain, not the humble pottery of the servants' quarters, but the crystalline note of something rare, precious, and irreplaceable. Her heart lurched. The heavy glass doors to the conservatory gave way to a world transformed by the pale light of morning. Frost clung to the edges of the panes, casting a faint silver glow over rows of hothouse orchids and camellias. Amid this still beauty lay ruin, the shattered remains of a Ming vase, its once perfect curves reduced to jagged fragments upon the mosaic floor. Thomas stood nearby, small and pale, his hazel eyes wide with fear. His little hands clutched the hem of his patched tunic, the fabric trembling as much as he did. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She stepped toward him, her voice soft but urgent. Yet before she could gather him into her arms, she saw the other figure in the room. Tall, imposing, and draped in the somber elegance of black velvet, Prince Edmund of Lancaster stood over the scene like a figure carved from shadow and light. His cloak, edged in dark fur, seemed to absorb the winter's chill, while the silver embroidery along his doublet caught the faint glimmer of the frost. His grey-blue eyes, clear, penetrating, yet weighted with something unspoken, moved from the broken porcelain to the trembling child, and at last to her. Beatrice froze. The rules of the house were as unyielding as the stone it was built from. A servant who brought damage to the Duke's possessions faced not only dismissal, but disgrace. And this was no mere trinket. It was a treasure displayed only on rare occasions, a gift from a faraway ambassador. She expected harsh words, the summoning of the steward, perhaps even the wrath of the Duke himself. But the prince did not speak at once. Instead, he regarded her with a measured stillness, his gaze lingering in a way that unsettled her more than anger might have. In that silence, the air between them seemed to grow heavy, charged with something neither of them could name. She bent to shield Thomas, her shawl falling forward, the faint scent of lavender from her linen sleeves mixing with the fragrance of orchids. The child pressed his face into her skirts. When she dared to look up again, the prince had taken a step closer. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm, carrying the refined cadence of the court, yet softened by an unfamiliar warmth. "The boy is frightened," he said quietly, not as an accusation but as an observation. Beatrice could only nod, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Her hands rested protectively on Thomas's shoulders, her pulse quickening beneath her coif. For a moment that seemed suspended outside of time, their eyes held, hers, wide with worry, his, shadowed by grief she could not yet understand. And in that unspoken exchange, beneath the pale winter light filtering through the frost-laced glass, something fragile took root. Not yet trust, not yet hope, but the first stirring of a connection neither of them had sought, yet both would remember. York, England. The winter of 1602 lingered over Wexbury Hall like a pall of grey silk, heavy and unyielding. The days were short, the pale sun often hidden behind curtains of fog, and the air carried the sharp, metallic scent of frost. Within the vast stone walls, life moved according to the rigid rhythms of rank and service. Footsteps echoed in the corridors, hushed voices carried through the galleries, and every glance was measured, every gesture weighed. Yet, beneath the strict order of the Duke's household, a subtle tremor had begun to spread. It began with whispers in the servants' quarters, rumours brought in with the morning bread from the market, murmured over the steam of boiling kettles. Prince Edmund of Lancaster, cousin to the Queen herself, had not come to Wexbury merely for a winter retreat. His arrival carried with it the shadow of a story already woven in London's court. A prince in self-imposed exile after the loss of his wife and the unborn child she carried. Some spoke of fever, others of divine punishment, others still of a love so fierce that its absence had hollowed him beyond repair. The servants speculated, their words cautious but tinged with fascination. Beatrice listened without comment as she scrubbed silver platters or folded the Duke's linen, the clink of metal or the soft rustle of cloth marking her silence. She was not one to dwell on gossip. Life had taught her the value of keeping her thoughts behind locked doors, but she could not ignore the atmosphere that trailed after the prince. Even the air seemed to change when he entered a room, as though time itself paused to take note. Her first encounter since that morning in the conservatory came 2 days later, in one of the narrow side corridors that connected the servants' domain to the grand stairwell. The corridor was dim, lit only by a high, narrow window, through which the weak winter light fell in a pale ribbon across the worn flagstones. Beatrice had been carrying a tray of polished goblets toward the butler's pantry when she heard footsteps approaching, measured, deliberate, unhurried. She stepped aside, her back to the cool stone wall, lowering her gaze as protocol demanded. When he passed, the faint scent of wood smoke and something darker, spiced leather perhaps, brushed against her senses. For a moment, she dared lift her eyes. His face was composed, but there was a shadow there, as if grief had carved its mark into the set of his jaw and the line of his mouth. Their gazes met briefly, and in that fleeting instant she saw something that unsettled her, not the distance of a nobleman regarding a servant, but a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had been aware of her presence before she had even stepped aside. No words were exchanged. The moment was gone almost as quickly as it came, yet it lingered in her thoughts long after she resumed her work. Another encounter followed the next morning, this time in the warmth of the kitchens. The air was rich with the aroma of baking bread, roasting fowl, and simmering broth. The hearth crackled, and the bustle of scullery maids and cooks filled the space with purposeful noise. Beatrice had come to fetch a tray for Lady Eleanor's mid-morning tea, her hands busy arranging delicate porcelain cups and slices of candied quince. She was adjusting the silver spoon beside the sugar pot when a ripple of silence passed through the room. The kitchen door opened, and there he was, Prince Edmund, his black velvet doublet stark against the warm, earthy tones of the room. The servants froze, mid-task, eyes darting to one another. A prince did not wander into the kitchens without purpose. He spoke briefly to the cook, inquiring after the conservatory's supply of oranges for the Duke's table, his voice deep but lacking the formal sharpness of courtly command. As he turned to leave, his gaze brushed over the room and found her. There was no startle, no flicker of surprise in his expression, only a pause, as though her presence had interrupted a thought he had not realized he was having. Beatrice lowered her head quickly, aware of Lady Eleanor's ladies-in-waiting gossiping by the far wall. Yet in that swift glance, she felt the peculiar weight of being seen. not as a maid with her hands full of another woman's service, but as someone whose existence had registered in the quiet map of his attention. By the third day, she began to notice patterns. He never lingered in the great hall during the Duke's lengthy discussions, but often walked the quieter parts of the house, as though seeking refuge from the eyes and ears of his peers. Sometimes she would catch sight of him from a distance, standing by a frost-rimmed window, his hand resting on the carved sill, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the snow-laden gardens. Other times she glimpsed him in the chapel, kneeling alone in the pews, the flicker of candlelight tracing the lines of his face in solemn reflection. There was a loneliness in him that mirrored something in herself, though she could not have said why. She had lived with solitude for so long, it had become a part of her, a constant companion in the quiet hours after Thomas was asleep. Yet here was a man surrounded by power and privilege, moving through gilded halls as though he carried a weight that could not be set down. The class divide between them loomed like an unscalable wall. She knew her place, knew the rules of conduct, as well as she knew the rhythms of her own breath. But there were moments, brief, unguarded, when that wall seemed less like stone and more like mist. Lady Eleanor, however, saw no mist. She saw only the outlines of impropriety, faint but enough to stir her suspicion. Tall, regal, with a presence that commanded deference, the Lady of Wexbury Hall missed little within her domain. Beatrice was aware of the woman's eyes upon her more often than before, a subtle tightening of lips when she entered the room, a glance that lingered a heartbeat too long. The Duke himself made no mention of the prince's behavior, but Beatrice had seen the set of his mouth when Edmund declined to join the household in the drawing room one evening. She had been replenishing the firewood near the hearth when the Duke muttered to his steward about the prince's melancholic humours and the need to ensure his comfort without indulging his whims. Life in the household continued with its usual formality, but beneath it all, Beatrice sensed the current shifting. She carried on with her duties, mending linens, polishing candlesticks, tending to Lady Eleanor's gowns, but the awareness of the prince's presence lingered like a change in the weather. One afternoon, as the pale light of day began to fade, she was sent to deliver fresh gloves to the prince's chambers. The corridor leading to his rooms was quiet, the stone underfoot chilled even through her worn shoes. She knocked softly, expecting the valet to answer, but it was Edmund himself who opened the door. He was without his cloak, dressed in a dark doublet of fine wool, the collar slightly loosened as though he had been reading or writing. The fire in the hearth behind him cast a golden glow across the room, revealing shelves of books and a small table set with an untouched cup of wine. "Your gloves, my lord," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly as she held out the bundle. His gaze lingered on her face, a fraction longer than necessary, before he accepted them. "Thank you, Mistress Hartwell." The way he spoke her name was neither hurried nor careless. It was deliberate, as though tasting the shape of it. She lowered her eyes, murmured a polite farewell, and turned to go. Yet before she could take more than 2 steps, his voice stopped her. "The gardens are fairer in winter than many give them credit for," he said quietly, as if sharing a thought not meant for the ears of the court. Beatrice paused, uncertain whether to respond. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and continued down the corridor, her heart beating too quickly for the simple exchange they had shared. That night, as she tucked Thomas into bed and listened to the wind rattling against the shutters, she thought of the prince's eyes, grey-blue like the sky before snow, and the subtle thread of sorrow woven through his every word. She did not understand it, and she told herself it was none of her concern. Yet, try as she might, she could not banish the feeling that somehow, in ways neither of them could name, their lives had begun to shift toward one another. York, England. The winter of 1602 held Wexbury Hall in a quiet grip, its stone walls embracing the hush of the season. The sky outside was a pale wash of silver, and the frost lay thick upon the gardens, coating each branch and leaf in a crystalline shimmer. The conservatory, with its wide panes and domed roof, stood like a jewel box at the edge of the inner courtyard, its glass glowing faintly in the weak light of morning. Beatrice Hartwell approached with a pail and a folded linen cloth in her hands. The corridor leading there was cold and narrow, the echo of her steps softened by the wool of her skirts. She had been assigned to dust and wipe down the stone benches, polish the copper watering cans, and check that no frost had crept in to harm the Duke's exotic collection of plants. It was work she had always found calming. The conservatory was a place where the air smelled faintly of damp earth and the outside world felt far away. Pushing the heavy door open, she stepped inside and was met by a rush of moist, fragrant air. The glass panes were misted at the edges, the heat within a balm against the chill she had carried in her bones. Rows of orchids, their pale petals kissed with frost from the outer edges of the glass, stood alongside bright camellias, ferns, and the curious twisting shapes of imported citrus trees. She paused for the briefest moment, allowing her eyes to adjust to the softened light filtering through the frosted glass. It was then she saw him. Prince Edmund stood at the far end of the conservatory, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture straight yet somehow unguarded. The black velvet of his doublet contrasted sharply with the pale blooms beside him, while the silver thread at his cuffs caught the faint morning light. He was studying a cluster of orchids with a gaze that was neither idle nor hurried, as if the intricate folds of each petal held a secret he alone was meant to decipher. Beatrice's first instinct was to withdraw. The rules of the house dictated that a servant should not intrude upon a private moment of a guest, least of all one of royal blood. But before she could retreat, his voice, low and steady, carried across the space. "Mistress Hartwell." Her steps faltered, and she inclined her head, moving forward just enough to set the pail down upon a bench. "My lord." For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of water dripping faintly somewhere among the ferns. Then, without turning from the orchids, he spoke again. "They were a gift from the Spanish court. They thrive in winter, though most believe them too fragile to endure it." As she glanced toward the blossoms, their white petals veined faintly with pink, standing delicate yet resolute in their clay pots. "Perhaps they endure because they have no choice," she said softly, her hands busy with the cloth, though her eyes remained on the flowers. He looked at her then, and the faintest curve of something, almost a smile though tinged with something more solemn, touched his lips. "You speak from knowledge, not fancy." Beatrice lowered her gaze to the task before her, wiping the damp from the bench's edge. "One learns, my lord, that survival often depends on adapting to what cannot be changed." A silence followed, but it was not an empty one. The air between them felt altered, warmer, as though the plants themselves leaned in to listen. He took a step toward her, not so near as to breach decorum, yet close enough that she caught the faint scent of fur and cold air lingering on his cloak. "My wife," he said at last, his tone quieter, "could not adapt, not to the winters here, nor to the life that was required of her." His gaze returned to the orchids. "When she died, I thought perhaps I had failed her in not shielding her from it." Beatrice's cloth stilled in her hands. She did not lift her eyes, sensing that what he spoke now was not for idle sympathy. "There are storms no man can shield against, my lord," she murmured, her voice steady but low. "Some come from without, others from within." Something in his expression shifted, though she could not name it. Perhaps it was the recognition of shared understanding, of grief worn like an invisible garment. Before the quiet could deepen into something neither of them could explain, the sound of light footsteps approached. "Mama!" Thomas's voice, soft and hesitant, broke the stillness. The boy appeared at the doorway, his cheeks pink from the cold, his small cloak askew over one shoulder. He carried something in his hands, a smooth stone he had found in the courtyard, pale and round, with a faint, natural marking. Beatrice straightened at once, her maternal instinct warring with the awareness of who stood beside her. "Thomas, you should not—" But Edmund had already crouched slightly to meet the boy's gaze, his height reduced so that his eyes were level with the child's. "And who is this young gentleman?" he asked. His tone softened into something almost playful. Thomas looked to his mother, uncertain. Beatrice hesitated, then said, "My son, my lord." The prince extended a gloved hand, palm upward. "May I see what you have there?" Thomas stepped forward, the hesitation in his small frame giving way to curiosity. He placed the stone in Edmund's palm. The prince studied it for a moment, turning it over between his fingers. "It looks as though the earth itself painted this for you," he said, handing it back. "A treasure, indeed." The boy's face brightened with a shy smile, and for a fleeting instant, Beatrice saw a gentleness in Edmund's features that had been absent until now, a warmth that smoothed the sharp edges of his grief. The moment was broken by the creak of the outer door. A kitchen maid, her apron dusted with flour, had stepped in to fetch a sprig of rosemary from the potted herbs. Her eyes fell upon the scene. Beatrice standing close to the prince, Thomas smiling up at him, the air between them threaded with an ease rarely seen across such a gulf of station. She lingered just long enough to gather what she needed, her gaze quick and assessing, before slipping back out into the cold. Neither Beatrice nor Edmund seemed to notice her departure, but somewhere in the narrow arteries of the servants' hall, the first whisper had already been born. Thomas's laughter, a rare, light sound, spilled into the warm air as Edmund made some quiet remark to him. Beatrice watched, her heart caught between caution and a strange, unfamiliar flutter she could not suppress. She had not heard her son laugh like that in many months, yet even as she stood in that tranquil moment, the image of the kitchen maid's eyes returned to her mind. In a household such as this, warmth between a servant and a guest of high rank was not simply noticed, it was remembered, repeated, reshaped by the telling. Still, as she gathered her things and guided Thomas toward the door, she could not help but glance back. Edmund remained by the orchids, one hand resting lightly on the carved wooden bench, his gaze following them with an expression she could not quite read. It was not pity, nor was it mere politeness. It was something else, something that made the air feel different, as though the frost upon the glass had thinned, letting in a light that had been absent for far too long. York, England. The winter of 1602 lay heavy upon Wexbury Hall, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs, the sky a low canopy of pewter. The frost had settled thick across the lawns and gardens, rendering every blade of grass, every barren branch, into a thing of fragile beauty. Inside the great house, however, the chill was not only of the season, it was in the air between certain glances, in the measured tones of words chosen with care, in the silences that lingered a moment too long. Beatrice Hartwell was summoned before the hour of noon. She had been in the laundry room, folding the last of the freshly aired linens, when the steward appeared in the doorway, his face set in the neutral expression of a man who carried orders he dared not soften. "His Grace requires your presence in his study," he said, and nothing more. Her hands stilled over the folded linen, a single breath caught tight in her chest. Summons to the Duke's study were rare for a servant, rare and seldom for praise. She smoothed her skirts, checked that her coif was properly in place, and followed the steward through the winding corridors, each step echoing faintly in the stillness. The study was a room of shadowed authority. Heavy curtains framed the tall windows, shutting out what little daylight the morning offered. The fire in the hearth burned low, more for form than comfort, and the air smelled faintly of ink, parchment, and the polish of the Duke's vast oak desk. He stood behind it, tall and rigid, his silver hair glinting in the dim light. His gaze was as cold as the frost outside. "Mistress Hartwell," he began, his voice measured, the sort that gave nothing away, yet carried the weight of judgment. "It has come to my attention that you have been in conversation with our guest more than once." Beatrice kept her eyes respectfully lowered, her hands clasped lightly before her. My lord, I serve where I am required, and I speak only as courtesy demands." He regarded her for a long moment, as though measuring the truth of her words against what he had heard. "Courtesy," he repeated slowly, and yet the servants' tongues wag. "They speak of your boy laughing in the conservatory, of the prince bending his attention to you as though you were an equal." His voice hardened, though it never rose. "You know as well as I that such talk stains not only your name, but the dignity of this household." Her heart thudded once, painfully. She chose her words with care. "My only wish, my lord, is to fulfill my duties without fault. If there has been offense, I assure you it was never intended." He circled the desk, coming to stand before her. His height and presence pressed upon her like the shadow of a great tree. "Your position here, Mistress Hartwell, is not unassailable. A servant's place rests on trust. Should that trust be in doubt, the consequences are swift." The message was clear. She walked upon a thread stretched thin over an abyss. She inclined her head, murmuring, "I understand, my lord." A faint nod was his only reply before he dismissed her. The door closed behind her with a sound that seemed to echo down the corridor. She moved through her duties that day with quiet precision, but attention lingered in her every movement. By mid-afternoon, the air in the halls had grown close, and she slipped out to the gardens to draw a breath of cold, unfiltered air. The gardens lay beneath a lace of snow, the pathways edged with frost, the hedges shaped into silent sentinels. Her breath curled before her as she walked, each step crunching softly on the frozen gravel. She paused near the bare branches of a rose arbor, its skeletal form etched in white, the memory of summer blooms long gone. It was there that she heard the sound of approaching steps, slower than the quick tread of a servant, more measured, yet with a presence that seemed to claim the very air around it. She turned and found Prince Edmund striding toward her, his cloak dusted with snow, the dark fur at its collar framing the austerity of his face. "Mistress Hartwell," he said, his voice low but edged with something unspoken. "I heard you were summoned to the Duke." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It was nothing, my lord, a reminder of my place." His eyes narrowed slightly, the grey-blue darkening like a sky before snow. "A reminder given in kindness or in warning?" Her lips pressed together. "The latter, I believe." He stepped closer, the cold air carrying the faint scent of leather and the winter outside. "And for what offense?" Her gaze wavered before she answered. "It seems our conversations have not gone unnoticed. My son's laughter in your presence has become fodder for the servants' tongues. The Duke fears for the dignity of his house." Edmund's jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask of royal composure slipped, revealing a flicker of something more, anger, perhaps, or indignation. "If the dignity of this house rests upon the silence of a child's laughter, then its foundations are frailer than I thought." Beatrice lowered her eyes. "You speak as a prince, my lord. I must live as a servant." A silence fell, heavy and close, filled with the soft hiss of wind through the bare branches. When she looked up again, he was studying her with an intensity that seemed to strip away every layer she had wrapped around herself. "What of the boy's father?" he asked quietly, not as a challenge, but as a question that sought understanding. She drew in a slow breath, her fingers tightening on the folds of her skirt. "He was a soldier in the Duke's service. We were to be wed when he returned from a campaign in the north. He never did. A fever took him before he knew I was with child." Her voice held steady, but her eyes shone with the memory. "The Duke allowed me to remain in service on the condition that my son stay out of sight." Edmund's expression softened, the lines of grief in his own face shifting into something more like respect. "And you have borne this alone." She lifted one shoulder slightly, a gesture of quiet endurance. "One learns to carry what cannot be put down." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred a scatter of snow from the arbor above, the flakes drifting between them like small, silent messengers. When he spoke again, his voice was softer still, almost an oath. I will not see you or your son come to harm because of me." Her heart gave a single startled beat at the promise in his tone, but she forced herself to answer with measured calm. "My lord, such words are kind, but kindness does not shield against consequence." His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. Perhaps not, but resolve might. The moment stretched between them, suspended in the cold air, until at last she inclined her head. "Then I thank you for your resolve." He gave the barest nod, his eyes still fixed on her as if committing her face to memory. Then he turned, his cloak sweeping lightly over the snow, and walked back toward the house. Beatrice remained beneath the rose arbor for a moment longer, the cold biting at her fingers, the echo of his words lingering in the air around her. Somewhere deep within, past the caution and the fear, a fragile ember of something warmer stirred. York, England. The winter of 1602 lay over the land like a cloak of silver and shadow, its chill pressing against the ancient stones of Wexbury Hall. The great fireplaces burned through the afternoon, their warmth pooling in corners and hallways, but the air still carried that faint bite that made every breath feel sharper, every sound more distinct. Tonight, the house glowed from within. Candles stood in tall holders along the walls, their flames trembling slightly in the draughts that slipped under the carved doors. Servants moved with quiet urgency, their steps softened by thick rushes underfoot, preparing the great hall for the evening's feast in honor of Prince Edmund. Beatrice Hartwell had spent most of the day in service of the preparations, laying out polished pewter plates, ensuring the linens on the trestle tables fell in even lines, and arranging bowls of winter greenery with sprigs of holly for the long board where the household and guests would dine. She had worked without pause, yet as the hour drew near, a current of unease began to run beneath her composure. She told herself it was the usual tension that accompanied any formal gathering under the Duke's roof. But she knew better. The thought of his presence, of Edmund, seated in the place of honor, his face illuminated by 100 candles, made her pulse quicken in ways she could neither name nor admit. The great hall was a scene drawn from a tapestry when the guests began to arrive. The high-timbered ceiling soared above, its beams lost in shadow. Along the walls, the flickering light danced over the heraldic banners, each bearing the proud symbols of Wexbury's lineage. The tables gleamed with pewter and polished glass. Platters of roasted meats sent curls of fragrant steam into the air. In the center, the long head table awaited the Duke, his lady, and their distinguished guest. Beatrice moved quietly among the other serving women, a flagon of red wine cradled in her hands. She kept to the edges, as was proper, her eyes lowered when approaching the gentry, yet no act of will could prevent the small betrayals of her gaze, those fleeting, unbidden moments when her eyes sought him. Edmund sat at the Duke's right, the black velvet of his doublet offset by a crisp white ruff that framed the lines of his face. The candlelight touched the silver threads at his temples, making them gleam like frost, and lent his grey-blue eyes a depth that seemed almost shadowed. He listened with courteous attention to the Duke's words, nodded to Lady Eleanor when she addressed him, but there was a stillness about him, as if part of his mind were elsewhere. Once, as Beatrice moved between tables, she dared to glance up, and found his gaze upon her. It was not the brief acknowledgement of a guest to a servant, nor the idle glance of one scanning a crowded room. It was fixed, deliberate, and when their eyes met, it was as though the din of conversation and the clatter of cutlery fell away. She felt the warmth rise to her cheeks before she could look down, retreating into the safety of her duties. The evening unfolded with a measured grace. The court musician seated near the hearth began to play a slow, melancholic tune on the viol, the notes winding through the hall like a thread of smoke. Conversation softened, the rhythm of the music seemed to draw the guests into its quiet spell. Beatrice approached the head table to refill the prince's goblet. She could feel the weight of his attention before she reached him, though his face remained composed. As she poured the wine, the back of her hand brushed against the fine leather of his glove, so lightly that no one else could have noticed. but enough to send a jolt through her that was both startling and unsettling. She stepped back quickly, eyes downcast, murmuring the expected "my lord" before retreating. The music swelled briefly before fading into a final lingering note. Laughter and talk resumed, but for Beatrice the air seemed charged, the echo of that faint touch clinging to her skin. She told herself it was foolishness, nothing more than a moment's accident, yet her heart would not be stilled. When the feast ended and the guests began to withdraw to the drawing rooms, Beatrice joined the quiet tide of servants, clearing platters and refilling goblets. She kept to the shadows, her tasks a shield against the restlessness that had settled in her chest. By the time the hall had emptied, she was almost convinced she had imagined the weight of his gaze, the silent conversation carried in it. It was late when she left the warmth of the kitchen, carrying a basket of linens toward the narrow stair that led to the servants' quarters. The passage was dim, lit only by a single wall sconce, the air cooler here where the stone walls seemed to drink in the heat. Her steps echoed softly in the quiet. She turned a corner and stopped. Edmund stood there, as though he had been waiting. He had removed the heavy cloak he wore in the hall. The dark wool of his doublet seemed to merge with the shadows, leaving the pale planes of his face and the glint of his eyes as the only bright points. For a moment, neither spoke. The faint crackle of the torch on the wall was the only sound. Then he stepped toward her, not with haste, but with a deliberation that made the air between them tighten. "Mistress Hartwell," he said, his voice pitched low, as though even the walls might betray them. "My lord," she managed, her voice steady though her fingers tightened on the handle of the basket. He stopped just short of touching her, his presence filling the narrow space, the faint scent of leather and the lingering warmth of wine in the air around him. "You have been in my sight all evening," he said, not as a boast, but as a simple truth. "And though I told myself to look elsewhere, I could not." Her breath caught. "You risk much in saying so, my lord. And you, in hearing it," he replied, his eyes holding hers. "But there are moments, Mistress Hartwell, that will not be left unsaid." She did not move, though every instinct urged her to retreat. Yet she could not. The closeness was a quiet storm, and she felt herself drawn into it as surely as a branch bends toward the wind. He reached for the basket, his gloved hand brushing against hers as he took it from her grasp and set it aside. The touch was fleeting, almost nothing, and yet it was everything. The warmth of his fingers through the fine leather lingered in her skin, a sensation she felt all the way to her heart. For a long breath they stood in that narrow passage, the torchlight casting their shadows together on the wall. Then, with the same care as one might close a precious book, he stepped back. "Good night, Mistress Hartwell," he said softly. "Good night, my lord," she answered, her voice no more than a whisper. He turned and walked away, his steps measured, leaving her in the dim glow of the torch, the air still carrying the echo of his presence. Beatrice remained there for a moment, her pulse still unsteady, her thoughts a tangle she dared not unravel. When at last she lifted the basket again and continued toward the servants' stair, it felt as though she carried not just linen, but the weight of something new, something she could neither name nor set aside. York, England. The winter of 1602 deepened, its grip tightening on Wexbury Hall with each passing day. The sky remained a low, unbroken grey, and the air was so cold it seemed to hum in the ears. Fires burned from dawn until nightfall, their light flickering over stone walls and polished wood, yet the warmth felt fragile, fleeting, as if it might be swept away at the first opening of a door. In that cold, the rhythm of the household moved on, precise and ordered, but under its surface, tension coiled like a rope drawn taut. It was a morning like any other when the letter arrived. The messenger, wrapped in a riding cloak stiff with frost, delivered it to the Duke's steward, who carried it in with a solemnity befitting the seal pressed into its red wax. The crest was unmistakable, the Tudor rose encircled by Latin script. The hand that had written Edmund's name in the address was one used to commanding both loyalty and obedience. The letter was taken to the prince in his chambers, and though no word passed beyond the threshold, the atmosphere shifted almost at once. By the time Edmund descended to the great hall, the news had already begun to seep through the household. The Queen had summoned him back to London. The reason, as whispered among the servants, was a matter of alliance. An arranged union meant to strengthen the crown's influence among the nobility. Beatrice learned of it not from the lips of a gossiping maid, but from the silence that followed her entry into the linen room, where two of the footmen stood talking in low voices. They broke off the instant they saw her, the glance they exchanged confirming that their words had not been for her ears. She said nothing, but a chill settled over her that had nothing to do with the draught that crept under the door. That day, Edmund moved through the house like a man bearing an unseen weight. His greetings were still courteous, his composure still intact, but there was an undercurrent to him now, an urgency that seemed to pull him towards certain places, certain people, and more often it was toward her. Beatrice found him that afternoon in the smaller of the two libraries, a room seldom used except for quiet study. Thomas was with her, helping to carry a stack of folded blankets to be stored in the press. The boy's cheeks were flushed from the warmth of the fire, his hair curling slightly at the nape where the heat had touched it. Edmund looked up from the window where he had been standing, his gaze softening at the sight of them. "Is that not too heavy for you, Thomas?" he asked, stepping forward. Thomas shook his head, the stubborn spark in his eyes making Beatrice's lips curve despite herself. "It is not heavy, my lord." The prince crouched slightly to meet the boy's gaze. From within his doublet he drew something small, a wooden soldier, carved with simple lines but with care evident in the shaping of its form. The wood was smooth, darkened by polish, and though unadorned, it carried a weight that made it more than a mere toy. "This was mine when I was your age," Edmund said, placing it in Thomas's hands. "It is a soldier who never leaves his post, no matter the storm." The boy's face lit with a smile so pure it made Beatrice's breath catch. She could not remember when she had last seen that particular brightness in her son's eyes. "My lord, I cannot," she began, but Edmund's glance silenced her. It was not commanding, but resolute. "It is his now," he said quietly, as though sealing a promise. It was in that moment, as Thomas turned the small figure over in his hands with reverence, that Beatrice sensed the danger of it, not the soldier itself, but what it represented. A gift from a prince to a servant's child was not a gesture easily overlooked, nor one easily forgiven by those who measured propriety in the narrowest terms. Unseen by them, Lady Eleanor stood at the threshold of the library. Her posture was perfect, her face composed, but her eyes were sharp as a blade, freshly honed. She took in the sight before her, the prince, bent slightly toward the boy. Beatrice, standing close enough for her sleeve to brush the edge of his cloak, the child clutching the wooden soldier as if it were treasure. A muscle tightened briefly in her jaw before she turned away, her steps soundless against the carpeted floor. From that moment, the air in the household changed for Beatrice. Lady Eleanor's gaze followed her more often, weighing her in silence. There was no open rebuke, no outright command, but the scrutiny was constant, like the faint pressure of a hand at her back, guiding her toward an unseen edge. That evening, as the light faded early and the frost began to creep once more across the windows, Beatrice busied herself in the sewing room. The rhythm of needle and thread steadied her, the familiar pull of the fabric beneath her fingers a small anchor. Yet her thoughts strayed to the image of Thomas cradling that wooden soldier, to the way Edmund's voice had softened when he spoke to the boy, to the look in his eyes when he had met hers. Later, as she crossed the passage between the servants' wing and the main corridor, she caught sight of Edmund again. He was speaking with the Duke in low tones, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, but his gaze shifted briefly, finding her across the space. It was the briefest of connections, no more than a heartbeat, yet it carried with it the same weight as a spoken vow. In the drawing room, Lady Eleanor sat with her embroidery, the delicate silver thread glinting under the candlelight. When Beatrice entered to replenish the fire, the lady's eyes rose from her work and rested upon her. There was no smile, no greeting, only a measured stillness that spoke more clearly than words. "I trust the linens are in order," Lady Eleanor said at last, her tone smooth. "They are, my lady," Beatrice replied, setting the log upon the fire and watching the sparks leap upward before settling into a steady burn. "See that they remain so," the lady murmured, her gaze drifting back to her embroidery. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. Beatrice left the room, the echo of those words following her down the corridor. She knew, with the certainty that came from years of navigating the treacherous currents of service, that the gift in Thomas's hands had not gone unnoticed. And she knew, too, that Lady Eleanor was not a woman who left such matters to chance. That night, the household slept under the same roof. But for Beatrice, the walls felt thinner, the corridors narrower. The warmth of Edmund's kindness warred with the cold knowledge that it had been witnessed by eyes that would see in it not generosity, but impropriety. In her small chamber, Thomas slept soundly, the wooden soldier clutched in his hand. Beatrice watched him for a long moment, her fingers brushing a stray curl from his forehead. She whispered a silent prayer, not for herself, but for the boy who had never asked for more than she could give, and who now carried a gift that might cost them both far more than it was meant to. Far above, in the Duke's private rooms, Lady Eleanor set aside her embroidery. She moved to the window, looking out at the frost-silvered gardens below. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass, her eyes glinting with quiet resolve. The time for watching was over. The threads of her plan were already forming in her mind, each one leading to the same inevitable conclusion. Mistress Hartwell's place in this household was about to be tested, and if it unravelled, Lady Eleanor would be certain she was there to watch it fall. York, England. The winter of 1602 had reached its coldest depths, the kind of bitter chill that made the very stones of Wexbury Hall feel as though they held frost within them. Morning light spilled through the high, mullioned windows of the great hall in muted shafts, touching the polished wood of the long tables and glinting faintly off the burnished brass candelabras. The air was brisk with the scent of evergreens brought in for decoration, mingled with the faint tang of smoke from the vast hearth. Beatrice moved quietly through the hall, carrying a folded linen cloth over one arm as she set about preparing for the Duke's midday gathering. She had learned over the years that the great hall, with its vastness and echo, could make even the smallest sound feel exposed, so she stepped lightly, her presence meant to be unnoticed. But this morning, she felt the weight of eyes on her, glances that slid away too quickly when she looked up. The murmurs of servants passing behind the trestle tables seemed to shift and fade when she neared them. She had just placed the folded linen at the end of the table when a voice, cool and precise, cut through the space. "Mistress Hartwell." Beatrice turned. Lady Eleanor stood at the far end of the hall, her figure framed by the tall stone archway. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk, its stiff bodice embroidered with gold thread, the French hood upon her head gleaming with small seed pearls. Her poise was perfect, her gaze fixed upon Beatrice with the kind of stillness that preceded the draw of a blade. "Yes, my lady." Beatrice kept her voice even, her hands folded loosely before her. Lady Eleanor began to walk forward, each step measured, the soft rustle of her skirts the only sound in the great hall for a long moment. Servants stilled in their tasks, their attention drawn like moths to the slow, deliberate approach. "I have given thought to certain occurrences in this household," Lady Eleanor said, her voice carrying easily in the vaulted space. "Occurrences involving you and our honoured guest, His Grace, the Prince of Lancaster." Beatrice's fingers tightened against the linen she held, though she willed her expression to remain composed. "My lady, I serve the Prince as I serve all who enter under this roof. But Lady Eleanor raised one slender, ringed hand, silencing her. "Do not speak to me of service, Mistress Hartwell. Speak instead of the whispers that pass through these halls like a cold wind. Whispers of your boy, your nameless boy, laughing in the conservatory with a man who owes nothing to him. Whispers of a prince's gloved hand lingering too long upon yours in a servant's passage. Tell me, are these whispers false?" The words hung in the air, heavy and barbed. Somewhere along the wall, a serving maid's breath caught. The steward, who had been overseeing the placement of the benches, shifted uneasily but said nothing. Beatrice's voice, when it came, was steady, though her chest felt tight. "My son's father was a soldier in the Duke's service. He died before Thomas was born. That is the only truth there is, my lady." Lady Eleanor's eyes gleamed, but it was not with kindness. "And yet, how convenient for you that the truth cannot be confirmed. You stand here in my hall with the prince's attention fixed upon you, attention that might be redirected were it not for your watchful eyes and your boy's eager smile." The sting of the words struck deep, but what burned hotter was the knowledge that every ear in the hall was taking them in. Beatrice felt the heat rise in her face, though the air around her seemed to grow colder. "My lady," she said quietly, "I would never dishonor my position or this household." Perhaps," Lady Eleanor replied, her tone as smooth as ice. "But there are those who will believe what they wish to believe. And scandal, Mistress Hartwell, is a stain that spreads quickly. Take care it does not ruin more than your own name." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of unspoken things. Then Lady Eleanor turned, her skirts sweeping behind her as she left the hall, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. Beatrice stood frozen for a heartbeat, the eyes of the household upon her, before she turned and left through the side passage. Her steps quickened as she made her way to the servants' wing, where Thomas was helping the stable boy mend a strap. She took his hand without a word, her grip firm, and led him out into the cold air. They crossed the courtyard, the frost crunching beneath their boots, the wind sharp against their cheeks. The stables smelled of hay and horses, a familiar comfort, and Beatrice led Thomas into the farthest stall, where the light was dim and the air warmer. She knelt before him, brushing a lock of hair from his brow. "You've done nothing wrong, Thomas," she said softly. "Do you understand me?" The boy nodded, though his eyes searched hers for something more. She managed a small smile for him, though her own heart felt heavy with dread. The sound of boots on the packed earth reached her then, slow and deliberate. She rose to see Edmund stepping into the stall, his dark cloak sweeping behind him, the fur at its collar dusted with snow. His expression was not the open gentleness she had seen with Thomas, nor the quiet reserve he wore in the great hall. This was something colder, sharper, a controlled anger that seemed to hum beneath his composure. "I heard," he said simply. Beatrice's lips pressed together. "It is nothing, my lord, words meant to wound." "It is not nothing," Edmund replied, his gaze unflinching. "It is an insult to you and an affront to the truth, and I will not see it stand." She shook her head slightly. "My lord, to answer her is to feed the fire. I cannot risk more attention, not for myself and not for Thomas." His eyes softened then, though the steel beneath remained. "No harm will come to you, or to your son, not while I have breath in my body." Before Beatrice could answer, another voice broke the stillness. "What is this?" The Duke's figure filled the doorway, his presence a shadow against the pale light beyond. His eyes moved from Edmund to Beatrice, to Thomas, and back again. When he spoke, his tone was stripped of any pretense of civility. "This ends," he said. "By week's end, Mistress Hartwell, you and the boy will be gone from Wexbury. I will not have my household made the subject of tavern talk." Beatrice felt the words strike like a physical blow. Though she kept her chin lifted, Thomas's hand tightened around hers. Edmund's voice was low, but taut with restraint. You would turn them out into the winter for the sake of rumors. I would turn them out, the Duke said coldly, for the sake of my house's name, and I will hear no more of it. With that, he turned and left, his steps echoing down the stable corridor. The silence that followed was broken only by the shifting of a horse in its stall. Somewhere beyond, the wind carried the faint creak of the weathered stable doors. Servants, lingering just beyond sight, whispered in low voices. By evening, those whispers would slip into the corridors, into the servants' hall, and from there into the town beyond the gates. A tale of a maid, a prince, and the shadow of scandal would grow with each telling, as such tales always did. But in that moment, Beatrice could think only of the week ahead, of the cold that lay beyond the walls of Wexbury, and of the promise Edmund had made with a voice that seemed to hold more weight than any title. York, England. The winter of 1602 had turned restless, as though the season itself sensed the tension within Wexbury Hall. The winds that swept across the frozen gardens carried a low, mournful sound, rattling bare branches against the conservatory's glass walls. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds the color of tarnished silver, promising rain that would seep into every crevice and chill every bone. Beatrice Hartwell moved through the day with the quiet precision of habit, but beneath the surface, each hour seemed to echo with the relentless ticking away of time. The Duke's decree lay upon her like an invisible shackle. By week's end, she and Thomas would be gone. Every sound, every familiar sight of the hall carried the ache of a place she would soon have to leave. The knowledge pressed on Edmund as well, though he wore his composure like a soldier wears armor. Since the moment the Duke's sentence had been pronounced, he had sought her out in small, careful ways, an exchange of glances across the dining hall, a fleeting word in a shadowed passage, the faintest brush of his hand when no one was looking. Each moment, too brief to satisfy, carried a weight far greater than its length. That afternoon, the rain began. It was not the soft patter of a spring shower, but a steady, urgent downpour, striking the conservatory's glass in rhythmic waves. The sound filled the space like a low drum, the air inside warm and damp with the scent of earth and greenery. Beatrice had come to tend the plants one last time before her departure, moving between the rows of orchids and camellias with a care that was almost reverent. She had just leaned over to wipe a bead of condensation from a glass pane when the sound of footsteps reached her through the rain. She turned, and there he was. Prince Edmund stood just inside the doorway, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his black cloak, the fur at the collar glistening with droplets. His hair was damp, a single strand falling loose against his brow. His eyes, those grey-blue eyes that never failed to unsteady her, were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air between them seem suddenly thinner. "Mistress Hartwell," he said, his voice low, shaped by something heavier than formality. "My lord," she replied, straightening, her hands folding lightly before her to still their faint tremor. For a long moment, he said nothing. The rain's steady rhythm filled the space, the only sound between them. Then he crossed the room, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she could see the fine lines of weariness etched at the corners of his eyes. "I cannot leave this place," he said at last, "without telling you the truth of my heart." Beatrice's breath caught. "My lord, you should not." "I must," he interrupted, though his voice remained gentle. "From the first moment I saw you in this room, standing beside your son, I knew there was something in you that defied the life you've been given, and in these weeks, every hour I have spent near you has only deepened that knowing. I have stood before queens and councils, faced the demands of a crown, but it is here, with you, that I have felt alive." She turned from him, her gaze falling on the pale curve of an orchid petal, its fragility mirrored in the ache within her. "My lord, you speak of things that cannot be. You have a duty to the crown, to the queen who summons you. Your life is not your own to give." His steps followed her as she moved away, slow but certain. "And yet, What life is mine if it is lived without choice, without you? She closed her eyes briefly, the weight of his words pressing hard against the defenses she had built. You must not speak so, she whispered. If you defy her, you risk more than your name. You risk your place in the world. You risk everything. Edmund's hand, still gloved, came to rest lightly on the edge of the bench beside her. He did not touch her, but the nearness was enough to set her heart racing. What I risk, he said, his voice low, is worth nothing if it spares me the fate they have chosen, a union without meaning, a life bound to a court that values appearance above truth. I will not go back to that. I will not take the path they have marked for me. Her gaze lifted to his then, the pull of his eyes impossible to resist. You must, she said, though her voice wavered. If not for yourself, then for those who depend on you. Leave before you ruin yourself for a servant who has nothing to offer you but trouble. A faint smile, tinged with sorrow, touched his lips. You think I have not already chosen? She stared at him, searching his face for the meaning behind the words. I have written to the Queen, he said quietly. The letter left at dawn. I have refused the match she proposed. I told her I would not marry for politics, that my decision is final. Beatrice felt the ground shift beneath her, the enormity of what he had done settling upon her like the rain's unceasing weight. You should not have, she said, her voice barely more than breath. I could not do otherwise, he answered, not after knowing you. The silence that followed was thick with the things neither could say. The rain beat harder against the glass, running in rivulets down the panes, like the lines of an unwritten story. Outside, the gardens blurred into shades of grey and silver, the world beyond the conservatory seeming distant, almost unreal. Beatrice took a step back, her hands clasped tightly before her. My lord, Edmund, she said softly, the use of his name slipping out before she could stop it. If you care for me, truly care, then you will leave. You will protect what is still yours to protect. Do not let me be the reason you lose it. He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment she thought he might say more, might close that final space between them, but instead he inclined his head slightly, as though conceding something neither of them wished to name. I will not force your hand, he said, his voice quiet but steady. But know this, Beatrice. I have chosen my path, and whatever storms come, I will face them. For you. For Thomas. Her throat tightened, but she could find no answer that would not betray her. She turned away, focusing on the delicate curl of a fern frond, as though its green could anchor her against the flood rising inside. The rain continued its relentless song on the glass, and in that warm, fragrant space they stood in silence, two lives caught between the pull of duty and the gravity of the heart, the distance between them filled with all the things they could not yet say. York, England. The winter of 1602 had settled into a damp, bone-deep chill, the kind that crept into the joints and lingered there, no matter how many fires burned in the hearths of Wexbury Hall. The rain of the past days had frozen in the night, leaving the gardens glazed in ice, each branch encased in a fragile sheath of crystal. Indoors, the atmosphere was no warmer in spirit than it was beyond the walls. The Duke's decree, Beatrice and her son to be gone by week's end, hung over the household like a cloud heavy with snow. It was on the eve of her departure that the letter arrived from London. The messenger, weary from travel, delivered it directly into the Duke's hands. The seal of the crown glinted red against the pale parchment, a mark of authority that carried both weight and finality. Beatrice was in the corridor outside the great hall when the steward hurried past her, his eyes fixed ahead, the folded letter in his grasp. She told herself it was none of her concern, and yet something in her chest tightened as though some invisible thread bound her fate to whatever words were written within. By the time the Duke had read it, the news was already whispering its way through the servants' hall. The Queen would not compel Edmund to marry the noblewoman she had chosen, though she cautioned him that defiance carried its own price. The court, ever watchful, would not forget his refusal. To some, the letter might have seemed a reprieve, a victory even. But in the Duke's eyes, it was an insult to the order he held dear. Beatrice learned of his reaction moments later. She had just crossed the corridor to deliver fresh towels to the guest chambers when raised voices stopped her. The door to the Duke's study stood ajar, and through the narrow gap, she saw him standing rigid behind his desk, the parchment spread before him like a challenge. Edmund stood opposite, his bearing calm but resolute. "You undermine not only the crown's will, but my household." The Duke's voice cut through the air, cold as the frost outside. "You defy the Queen, and in doing so, you bring her displeasure to my very doorstep." "I defy a match I did not choose," Edmund replied evenly. "That is not the same as defying her." The Duke's hand struck the edge of the desk, the sound sharp as a crack of ice. "You will leave my house at once. Tonight, I will not have my name or my roof tangled in the scandal you have chosen for yourself." Beatrice's breath caught, the words lodging in her chest. She could not hear Edmund's reply, only the rustle of his cloak as he turned toward the door. Instinct sent her moving quickly away, so that when he stepped into the corridor moments later, she was already gone from sight. By nightfall, the air within Wexbury Hall was thick with the unease of servants who sensed the shifting tide. The usual murmur of evening duties was subdued, as though the house itself held its breath. Beatrice found Thomas in the small, draughty room near the scullery, where he had been helping fold linens. His cheeks were flushed, but not with the healthy glow of warmth. There was a heat there that set her on edge. "Thomas, are you cold?" she asked, brushing her hand across his brow. The skin burned faintly beneath her touch. He shook his head stubbornly, though his voice was quieter than usual. "I'm fine, Mama." But she saw the slight shiver in his shoulders and the way his small hands curled against himself. Without hesitation, she drew him into her arms and led him toward their chamber in the servants' wing. The corridors felt longer than usual, the lamps throwing pools of flickering light onto the floor. The storm outside had shifted to sleet, the wind rattling at the shutters as though seeking entry. By the time they reached the room, Thomas's eyes were heavy, his breathing shallower. She tucked him beneath their single woolen blanket, adding her own shawl over him for good measure. The wooden soldier Edmund had given him lay on the small table beside the bed. Thomas reached for it without opening his eyes, his fingers curling protectively around it. She was still kneeling beside him when the door opened quietly. Edmund stood in the threshold, the shadows of the corridor framing him. His cloak was gone, replaced by the dark doublet he often wore indoors, the silver thread at its seams catching the faint light. "I heard he was unwell," he said, his voice low but edged with concern. "It's nothing," she replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "A touch of the cold. He only needs rest." Edmund stepped into the room, his presence filling the narrow space. "The cold is no small matter in this weather," he said. "Let me stay." "You should not," she began, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It was not a request, it was a decision already made. He crossed to the bed and sat beside Thomas, resting a gloved hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. For a long while the room was silent, save for the sound of the wind beyond the walls. Beatrice busied herself at the small hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. Behind her, she heard Edmund's voice, softer than she had ever heard it, murmuring something to Thomas she could not quite make out. The boy stirred faintly, his fingers tightening around the wooden soldier. Hours passed in that small, dimly lit room. Edmund remained by the bedside, refusing to be moved. The world beyond those four walls, the Duke's anger, the whispers of the servants, the Queen's letter, seemed to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of Thomas's breathing and the quiet vigil kept by the man who had risked much already. Somewhere near midnight, the door opened again, this time revealing Lady Eleanor. She stood in the doorway, her candle casting a halo of light around her face. Her gaze swept the room, the prince seated beside the sleeping boy, Beatrice at the hearth, and something unreadable passed across her expression. She did not speak. Instead, she watched for a moment longer, her eyes lingering on Edmund's hand, now resting protectively over Thomas's. Then, with the smallest nod, she withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Beatrice turned to Edmund, the flicker of the fire catching in her eyes. "You should rest," she said, though her voice was gentler now. "I will rest when I know he is better," Edmund replied simply. The night wore on. Outside, the sleet softened to rain, the icy rattle against the shutters giving way to a steady patter. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread slowly, chasing back the cold that had seeped into the stone. Beatrice dozed in a chair by the hearth, waking at intervals to find Edmund still at his post, his gaze steady on the boy. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow window, Thomas's fever had eased, leaving his cheeks cool and his breathing deeper. The wooden soldier remained clasped in his small hand, its smooth surface catching the morning light. Edmund looked up then, meeting Beatrice's eyes across the bed. No words passed between them, yet something in that gaze, steady, unyielding, told her more than any vow could. In another part of the house, the Duke would already be awake, his decision unchanged. But here, in this quiet room, the battle lines had shifted. Lady Eleanor had seen, and Beatrice sensed, though she could not yet name it, that the war for her place in this household had turned in a way no decree could undo. York, England. The pale light of early morning crept over the frost-tipped gardens, spilling like silver into the corridors of Wexbury Hall. The air held that stillness particular to dawn, as if the world itself hesitated before taking its first breath. Within the Duke's private study, the fire was newly lit, its flames casting a muted glow over the dark oak panels and the heavy drapery that framed the tall windows. It was into this quiet that Prince Edmund of Lancaster entered. His steps were measured, his expression composed, but there was a resolve in the set of his jaw that even the cool air could not temper. The Duke was already at his desk, quill in hand, though his attention shifted at once to the man who approached him. "Your Grace," Edmund began, his voice carrying the weight of both formality and something far more personal. "I have come to make my intentions clear so that there may be no further room for doubt." The Duke leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing in wary expectation. "I will marry Beatrice Hartwell," Edmund continued, each word deliberate. "And I will name Thomas as her son under my protection, with all the rights and dignity that affords." For a moment there was only the muted crackle of the fire. The Duke's gaze was sharp, assessing, weighing the consequences as though they were coins in his palm. "You realize," he said at last, "what you risk in doing so. The Queen may have tolerated your refusal of her chosen match, but that tolerance is not without limits. You would bind yourself to a servant, and in so doing, invite the whispers of every court in England." Edmund's reply was quiet, but unwavering. "I would rather face a lifetime of whispers than a single day lived in regret." The Duke's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned slightly in his chair, as if to distance himself from the man standing before him, and looked out through the tall window at the icy gardens beyond. "A royal cousin is a dangerous man to oppose," he said, more to himself than to Edmund. And the Queen's letter was clear enough. Her disapproval would not be absolute. She will watch, but she will not act. When he turned back, there was a reluctant acceptance in his eyes, though his voice carried no warmth. "Very well, I will not stand in the way of what you intend. But do not mistake my consent for approval. You may wed the woman, and the boy may bear your name in protection, but the responsibility for what follows will be entirely yours." "That," Edmund said, with the faintest inclination of his head, "is all I ask." Later that morning, as if summoned by fate itself, a second letter arrived from London. This one bore the Queen's seal, the wax unbroken until Edmund himself opened it in the presence of the Duke. The words within were brief, but carried the weight of a crown. "I trust, dear cousin, that you have chosen a path which will bring you the peace that has eluded you since your loss. May this decision, however unorthodox, be the one that restores your heart to its rightful strength. The days that followed moved with a new rhythm, one no longer dictated by tension and secrecy, but by quiet preparation. The conservatory, which had once been the scene of shattered porcelain and uncertain beginnings, became the heart of those preparations. Its glass panes were polished until they gleamed, each smudge erased, every pane catching the winter sunlight like a jewel. The orchids, long tended under careful watch, unfurled new blooms, their colors vivid against the pale light of the season. Weeks later, on a morning touched by the first warmth of spring, the hallways of Wexbury were hushed in an entirely different way. The air was scented with fresh flowers, their fragrance drifting from the conservatory into the adjoining corridors. Outside, the bells of York Minster waited in silence, poised to mark the hour. Beatrice stood just beyond the conservatory's open doorway, her hands resting lightly on Thomas's shoulders. She wore a gown of soft ivory wool, modest in its cut yet graceful in every line. The sleeves, edged with delicate embroidery, bore the mark of her own handiwork. Her hair, usually confined to the strict coverings of service, was now arranged simply, a few loose strands framing her face. Thomas, his cheeks touched with healthy color, stood tall beside her. The wooden soldier rested in his pocket, hidden from view but present as a talisman. His small hand found hers, and she looked down at him with a smile that held both reassurance and wonder. Beyond the threshold, Edmund waited. He wore a doublet of deep blue velvet, the color rich against the pale light flooding the room. At his breast was a simple silver pin, engraved with the crest of his house. His gaze, when it found hers, was steady, anchoring her as surely as if he had reached out to take her hand. The conservatory had been transformed. Sunlight poured through the polished glass, spilling across the mosaic floor and pooling at the feet of the gathered blooms. Roses, lilies, and orchids stood side by side in a harmony of color, their fragrance mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and fresh earth. It was as if the room itself had been restored to the fullness of life, a mirror of the path they had chosen. Beatrice stepped forward, Thomas keeping pace beside her. Each step felt like the closing of a chapter and the opening of another. The murmur of gathered witnesses, few in number but chosen with care, was no more than a distant hum. All that was clear, all that was unshakable, was the man waiting for her at the center of the room. When she reached him, Edmund extended his hand. She placed hers within it, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment. His eyes held hers, the unspoken history between them flickering there, every glance, every word, every moment when the distance between them had felt insurmountable. The vows they spoke were simple, stripped of pomp, yet each word seemed to carry the weight of the journey that had brought them here. Promises of protection, of shared burdens, of a future not shaped by decree, but by choice. Thomas stood close, his presence a living testament to the truth that had bound them long before this day. As the final words were spoken, the bells of York Minster began to toll, their sound rolling over the city like a benediction. The notes seemed to fill the conservatory, mingling with the sunlight, the scent of flowers, the warmth of hands joined in commitment. Beatrice felt a breath leave her she had not realized she'd been holding. The echoes of that first day, the crash of porcelain, the sharp fear in her chest, were replaced now by something altogether different. A stillness not of silence, but of peace. When they stepped forward together, Thomas between them, the world outside seemed to open in welcome. The glass walls around them reflected not just their images, but the life they had chosen, the family they had claimed against all odds. The bells continued to ring, and with each peal, the air seemed to grow warmer, the light brighter. The scent of spring blossoms lingered, mingling with the faint trace of lavender from Beatrice's gown and the familiar notes of leather and spice that clung to Edmund. And so they walked on, the three of them, into a future shaped not by rumor or rank, but by the quiet, unshakable truth of the heart's own choosing. York, England. The spring of 1610 had come early, scattering pale blossoms across the gardens of Wexbury Hall. The air was soft, touched by the scent of lilac and new grass, and the conservatory, once the place of broken porcelain and forbidden glances, now stood in full bloom, its glass aglow in the golden light of afternoon. Within, Beatrice moved with the ease of one at home in her place, her skirts brushing lightly against the mosaic floor. Her hair, touched now with the faintest threads of silver, was gathered simply at her nape, and her eyes, still warm, still steady, held the calm of a woman whose life had been hard won and fully lived. At the far end of the conservatory, Edmund bent over a pot of orchids, inspecting the petals with the same patient care he had given them on the day they first spoke. His hair had silvered more than hers, yet his presence was as commanding as ever, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened by years of both laughter and trial. They had faced storms together, but the years had not worn them down. Instead, they had settled into one another, as the roots of an old tree settled deep into the earth, steadfast, unshaken by passing seasons. Thomas, now 16, strode into the conservatory, his height nearly matching Edmund's. The wooden soldier was still in his possession, kept not in his pocket now, but displayed on a shelf in his chamber, a reminder of the day his life had shifted forever. His studies had taken him often to London, where he was received with the courtesy due to one under a prince's protection, but his loyalty to this house and to the two people who had become his anchor never wavered. Two younger children followed him, Anna, a bright-eyed girl of 7, with Beatrice's smile and a crown of chestnut curls, and Henry, only 4, whose quiet watchfulness reminded Edmund of himself at that age. They were the children of a union forged in defiance, proof that love, once chosen freely, could bear fruit long after the first vow was spoken. Beyond the walls of Wexbury, the world had shifted in ways neither of them could have imagined 8 years ago. The court, which had once watched Edmund's choice with suspicion, had turned its gaze elsewhere as new alliances rose and fell. The Queen herself had passed 3 years before, her reign remembered with both reverence and fear, and a new monarch sat upon the throne, a man more tolerant of those who stepped beyond the strict boundaries of class. Even so, not all hearts had softened. Lady Eleanor, who had once sought to drive Beatrice from the hall, had not attended the wedding all those years ago. Her health had declined in the years since, and though they spoke only rarely, Beatrice had visited her once during an illness, offering the civility Eleanor had never shown her. The Duke, older and slower now, had long since ceased to oppose the life they built, though whether from resignation or acceptance was hard to tell. In choosing to stand against him, Edmund had paid a price. Certain doors in court had closed to him forever, but he bore it without regret. As the afternoon light slanted through the glass, Edmund straightened from the orchids and crossed to where Beatrice stood. Without a word, he took her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles in that familiar, unspoken language they had shared since the beginning. She looked up at him, and for a moment they were once again those two figures standing among frost-kissed blooms, caught between caution and longing. 8 years, he said softly. She smiled, the warmth in her eyes deepening, and I would choose every one of them again. Outside, the bells of York Minster began to toll, their sound rolling gently over the city. It was not a wedding day, nor a day marked by decree, but still the bells seemed to belong to them, as they always had, heralding not a beginning, but the quiet triumph of a love that had endured. Edmund drew her closer, the faint scent of the orchids mingling with the spring air, drifting through the open panes. Around them, the laughter of their children echoed, mingling with Thomas's deeper voice as he called to them from the garden path. They stood together in the place where it had all begun. The years between then and now folded neatly into the moment. The world beyond the glass would go on changing as it always did. But within these walls, love had taken root and flourished, proving once and for all that some choices are worth every cost. Some stories stay with us not because they are perfect fairy tales, but because they remind us that love, real love, is a choice we make every day, even when the world tells us it's too difficult, too risky, or too costly. Beatrice and Edmund's journey was not just about defying titles or breaking rules. It was about daring to protect what truly matters, no matter the price. Their courage shows us that sometimes the most powerful victories are the quiet ones, the hand that refuses to let go, the promise kept across the years, the life built not from duty alone, but from the deepest desires of the heart. And perhaps that is the lesson we can carry with us. Love is not measured by the absence of trials, but by the strength that grows when two souls face them together. I would love to hear from you. What did this story stir in you? Which moment will you remember long after today? If you reach this point, write the word roots in the comments, so I'll know you walked this journey with me until the very end. If you wish to support the team that makes these stories possible, your super thanks here on YouTube, of any amount you can or wish, means more than you know. And if supporting in that way isn't possible right now, you can still help immensely by sharing this story with someone who loves historical romances as much as you do. Don't forget to explore the other narrations I've left for you in the cards. Tales just as moving, filled with longing, resilience, and the triumph of the heart. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be felt, remembered, and passed on.